Hello, everybody. Welcome to Holland IQ's webinar looking at our global climate tech landscape, Global Climate Tech 1000, and our report that's coming out really soon on all of that. My name is Bethany Hogan. I'm the Vice President of Client Experience here at Holland IQ, and I get the really great job of working with our incredible client community of leaders around the world. I am joined by Patrick Brothers, our co-CEO, who's calling from COP. Hey, how's it going? Busy week, huh?
Hey, Beth, massive week. Excited to be here and to join everyone. Thanks for joining.
Amazing. Okay, we know we have a ton of people calling in from all over the world, and in true Holland IQ fashion, a whole lot of information to get through in a really short period of time. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the agenda. So today we're going to start with why, and just really lay the groundwork with what were our motivations for doing the work we're going to go through, and really set the scene and establish what even is climate tech in the first place. Then we're going to do an overview of the 100-day process that led to our Climate Tech 1000 and jump into the landscapes we're seeing across the world in that segment. Then we're going to jump into our Landscape 1.0 open source taxonomy, which is our global climate tech taxonomy. You'll hear taxonomy, landscape pretty interchangeably. We like both of those here at Holland IQ. And then some more regional insights and benchmarking and more. But first, for anyone who's not familiar with Holland IQ, welcome. Great to see you here. We are the world's leading impact intelligence platform, serving clients all over the world in investment, institutions, and policymaking, tech development, really what I would call doers across climate, health, and education, SaaS subscription that includes really rich market intelligence across all of those segments. And our customers are, you can see some of them here, but companies that are really interested in the impact economy as they grow and evolve or shape decisions or investment, folks that, all over the world, and we're really proud to call them our clients.
Beth, just jumping quickly in before we dive into the content, I wonder if it's worth sharing with everybody, what you hear from customers and from partners around the world as to kind of the questions that they're asking with respect to climate tech or impact. I think that'd be a wonderful kind of backdrop to why we jumped into the Climate Tech 1000 and landscape.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, gosh, we definitely don't have all day to get into all of it, but if I were to pick a few favorites, definitely one of the most resonant right now is investors who are taking a really 360-degree approach to everything they're doing across their portfolio, be it environmental and social resilience, food systems, training and upskilling, even capacity building for policymakers in some cases. And then, this is a personal interest of mine, but looking at regional ecosystems and how you can promote innovation in a really holistic way. So that's definitely one of them. I'd say another one we're seeing a whole lot of interest in, both in terms of investment and just innovation, is future of work. That could be, as we see folks moving from more manufacturing to fourth industrial revolution, all the requisite upskilling and training that goes with that, impact from COVID affecting online workplace and even job loss. And, it's a really complex space, but we're seeing lots of investment and innovation there. I guess I'll give myself one or two more. Okay. Definitely a lot in advanced tech, though. I'm sure that's not surprising to anybody. Drones, Internet of Things, AI, AR, VR, data infrastructure, gosh, just so much. And of course, cyber is a really big factor. We're seeing a whole lot. And I'm going to indulge myself in my actual favorite, which is data democratization. I know that the phrase democratization of what is pretty tired at the moment, but we're just seeing a whole lot of open source technology, really open and accessible data to help people inform decision making, peer-to-peer. Whether it's like GIS systems, open source, to like enrollment data across different population trends. It's a really massive space. We're seeing a lot of interest.
Awesome.
Okay. I'll stop there, though. I could keep going because I know we've got a lot to cover.
That's awesome. That's a great backdrop. So let's jump into kind of the process of where we are, what we set out to do. So as Beth mentioned, we're so lucky to have incredible customers and partners around the world, from regional development banks, investors, NGOs, tech giants, operators across the impact spectrum. We set out 100 days ago to map the future of climate technology. So we teamed up with experts around the world in different regions in order to identify those organizations in the lead up to COP26. And this week, it's just been, an absolute pleasure to be here, to be immersed in the conversation, to talking with customers and partners and those who are meeting for the first time around the world to help kind of tackle. It's a really, really complex issue. We started with a bit of a prototype using our technology, using our coverage of the climate tech space to understand that. We'll look at that really shortly. We partnered around the world. We looked region by region rather than just one big global list. We wanted to dive into each region and understand the nuances and understand the context of what was happening and what was succeeding, where the gaps are as well. It was that analysis that kind of led us to the open source taxonomy, which we've launched this week while we're here at COP26, which will be all wrapped up with all of this content that you can see here in a report, which we're announcing early next week here at COP. And really, this was the culmination of that work. That 100-day, if you like, we set to come here with new insight on what's happening in the global climate technology landscape. So it's just exhausting and wonderful to be at that point right now. The first step that we had to take was to define climate technology, and we really built on top of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. We added a few pieces there to be more specific, but it was economic activities that make a significant or substantial contribution to climate change mitigation or adaptation, and that they are the product of new technology or scientific knowledge. And there's a whole bunch of qualifiers in there that we'll jump into shortly. This is the alpha prototype. We've done this in other impact sectors before, such as education. Each one of these dots or nodes that you can see represents a climate tech startup somewhere around the world working in adaptation or mitigation. And we essentially use our own advanced technology to not follow the old industrial rules of how this is all organized, but to come up with a fresh, organic way of seeing what are the relationships and the trends and the patterns. And we then use experts from our team and from around the world to see what patterns the machine learning has built on and try and understand it. And this was our hypothesis. This is what we went into the process looking for. Then, to identify the most promising startups in each region, we then apply a few criteria. Generally, we want to focus on organizations that are less than 10 years old, that are new, that are young, that are fast growing, and represent some of the latest thinking and business models and innovation. It's geography by geography. So this is not a big list of American startups or Chinese startups or Indian startups dominated by any one specific region. We wanted geographic diversity to find the best in each part of the world and to learn from those different parts as well. We wanted startups that were pre-exit, that they weren't yet all grown up, they weren't listed, they hadn't been acquired. And really specifically to climate tech, we wanted to exclude project finance and large other companies that represent a proven technology scaling versus a completely new approach. So we applied our typical criteria and methodology for impact startups. We looked at the market, we looked at the product, we looked at the team, specifically its expertise and diversity. We looked at capital, and that's not necessarily that it had raised an enormous amount of money, but it was that it had demonstrated the ability to secure the resources it needed to achieve its mission, its vision. And then finally, momentum. So positive changes in the size, velocity, and impact of the organization over time. It's probably no better way than to just jump in and very, very quickly share some of these maps in true HolonIQ style. As Beth said, it's going to be way too much, way too fast. All of this is available at holoniq.com as well for you to drill into. But just to give you a little bit of flavor, this was the Europe Climate Tech 200, the most promising climate tech startups across Europe, excluding Nordic Baltic. We'll have a look at that very shortly. You can see here really, really strong representation in networks, top right, but strong overall in all of these categories. One more note really quickly is you'll probably see the labels of these categories change as we move through. And that really evidences the live evolution of the taxonomy over the last 100 days. Nordic Baltic really deserved its own map. There is so much happening in the Nordic Baltic region that we just felt wouldn't be given justice by being captured as part of Europe main. And so here in Nordic Baltic, you see very heavy focus on the environment and mobility as part of that collection. Again, as part of EMEA, Middle East and North Africa, really different flavors. You can see here just visually very quickly a very heavy focus on agriculture and food systems as part of that. And the last part of EMEA was Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, you see here a very heavy focus on renewables and heavy focus on energy, still, doubling down on agri-food. So very, very quick lap of EMEA. Beth, did anything jump out at you on that lap?
Yeah, I think, some of this is not massively surprising. You would kind of expect to see renewables and agri be big in the MENA part of the EMEA, right? I guess I'm really interested to see, we talked a little bit about this, but I'm curious if others might be asking this too. Networks is a really interesting concept that I know has evolved in the process. Kind of where does that fall in the landscape? And I know we'll talk about it later, but what can you give us now?
Yeah, super quickly on the way through. Networks, let me just go back to the first one, was at the time represented the team getting their head around distribution, sharing, tracking, monitoring, kind of the network components, or the components making up the network of climate technology. It has evolved, and we'll look at that really shortly. Let's jump into the Americas. Firstly, North America, our definition here is Canada and the US. Mexico is part of the Latin America map here, but the North America 200 just absolutely packed. You see so much focus on data and finance, agriculture and food systems, again, a little bit less so on renewables, but heavier on biosphere. And then the LATAM top 50. So this is the most promising climate tech startups in Latin America. Again, you see that pattern of a very heavy focus on agriculture and food systems, but still strong representation around, much less so on mobility than we see in other markets. So two very different stories in the Americas.
Totally. Yeah, really interesting. A really interesting cross-section across all of them, really.
Let's dive into AsiaPac just as our last preview before we have a look at the taxonomy. So in AsiaPac, starting with Australia and New Zealand, tons of innovation happening. And you can see here really broadly represented as well, from renewables, strong focus on mobility, strong focus on the environment, again, from a heavy kind of agriculture and resources economy, agriculture and food systems isn't any surprise either, but very strong representation. East Asia, which is essentially China, Japan, and Korea in the main. Again, a big spread, but you can see how heavy the footprint in mobility is there on electric vehicles and electrification of transport systems, but still a really big focus on other areas like the environment and agri-food as well.
Pat, can I ask that mobility piece, is that largely driven by China? What's the story?
Yeah, there's a really strong representation there in China for sure. I think we've seen so much capital in China focus on EVs and on electrification of transport systems. And I mean, what a massive economy, big problem to solve there. That trend, carries over though. This is South Asia. Again, this is dominated by India, but includes the other SAARC countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc. Really strong focus on renewables, strong focus on mobility as well. But this mobility much more biased towards micro mobility than, large electric cars that we see in other markets. And then finally, in Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia Climate Tech 50, heavy focus on agriculture and food systems, but again, really strong across renewables, mobility, networks, and the environment as well. So that's again, way too much, way too fast tour of the Climate Tech 1000.
Yeah, just a reminder for everyone, these are available online, and don't worry, we'll give you lots of room to dive in. I know I'm continuing to kind of sink my teeth into it, and I hope everyone else is too. A couple of quick questions before we move on to the next piece, or maybe one, because I know we're getting close on time. I know that emerging markets have been a really big topic for COP26. Where in particular are you paying the most attention in those spaces?
Yeah, super interesting. You're right. I think something that's come out this week, we've gone through where are we now, the start of this week here, there's a lot of discussion about where do we want to be. And as every day passes, the conversation is more, how are we going to get there? And it's really clear that, advanced economies are facing really different challenges than emerging economies as it relates to the energy transition and climate technology in total. So, we're seeing, I think, more empathy. Definitely today, for example, I've seen a little bit more empathy for the challenges that emerging economies face versus advanced economies, and some, whether that is around food systems, whether that's around energy sources and the pace and the scope of the energy transition as well. So I think that's the bit that's intrigued me the most, other than, it's not well known to many, but about a third of emissions come from food systems and agriculture. It's kind of not obvious to the lay consumer, who thinks it all comes from kind of cars and aircraft and fossil fuels, but the problem is complex and requires kind of a little bit more investigation. So that's been, one of the most fascinating observations for me, seeing people, work through this week.
Totally. Okay. Well, I know the team has gone through a lot of work, and we've seen a few iterations of the taxonomy. Why don't you walk us through that?
Awesome. Love to. So we're going to break it down just step by step. This is only going to take a few minutes. The whole taxonomy is at globalclimatelandscape.org. As Beth mentioned, it's an open source taxonomy, like all the other work that we've done in sectors such as education. So one of our goals here is to create kind of a community-built global open source taxonomy that can help kind of untangle and help us all double-click on which areas. The fundamental building blocks of this open source taxonomy are energy to power the lives that we live, the natural environment that we've inhabited, and the built environment or the man-made environment of infrastructure spanning both buildings and transport systems in the main. When we break that down a little bit further, there are 10 what we call subsectors. So across energy, we have renewable sources, specifically we'll dive into shortly, alternative resources and also energy sources, storage systems, into the environment, biosphere, agriculture and food systems, the circular economy, carbon markets, data and finance, and then onto infrastructure through the built environment and mobility as well. So you can see the spectrum that we've tried to build here goes from energy through our natural environment into the built environment. And that is the foundation of the taxonomy. It layers down, though, as well. Like all of our work, we are just so data hungry and want the ability to double click and to benchmark, investigate, slice and dice, really get to the bottom of patterns that we're seeing around the world. So renewables unfolds into the 5 primary renewable sources: solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. Resources captures some newer forms of resources and energy. We've heard a lot about hydrogen. We've seen some big announcements just in the last week around nuclear from France and China. Critical minerals that are required in order to support these new electrification processes and other technologies, and then focusing on the oil and gas transition as well. It's likely to go for some decades, and we need to minimize the impact through the energy transition. Into storage, batteries, alternative mechanisms, grids to distribute energy, EV networks and EV charging, and finally the peer-to-peer patterns as well that we see in energy. In the environment, biosphere unfolds into land, oceans, ice and snow, and air. And we've pulled forests out because they're just so important. And we also wanted to double click from land and isolate forests and afforestation. Agriculture and food systems goes from smart farming, vertical farming. We focus on crops and on livestock very specifically. And then again, on alternative and plant-based meat and seafood, and plant-based and alternative dairy and egg as well. Mega categories in the food system. Circular economy, we look at sustainable materials, recycling in general, managing solid waste, water waste, and then finally textiles, which is an enormous part of maintaining a circular economy and sustainable materials. Carbon markets, just massive. Carbon capture and storage and utilization. Carbon offsets, both B2B and B2C. General carbon data and intelligence. Then finally, we're seeing a proliferation of it. More announcements this week around carbon accounting, reporting, ratings as part of managing that carbon economy. Data and finance goes from Internet of Things. This is a ecosystem that is rife with measurement and decentralized measurement and lots of it, through to data to manage all of that, the finance ecosystem supporting and financing initiatives, of course, risk. We're talking a lot here about our natural environment and about energy and about transport, and there's a lot of risk there, and part and parcel with risk is insurance. Finally, into infrastructure, on the home stretch is the built environment. So we start with design and construction. We look very specifically at heating and cooling. We look at residential buildings and commercial buildings. Whilst heavily connected, we look at them independently, and then finally transport infrastructure there. So that could be road, rail, seaports, airports, any form of infrastructure to support transport. And then one step I think that's unique, we haven't seen anywhere. We see a lot of, the banner transport in climate tech, but we wanted to separate out the infrastructure from the vehicles and the mobility that is part of that. It's actually really separate. It often gets conflated into the same bucket. So micro mobility, scooters, smaller forms, low impact forms of personal mobility, vehicles. So that's cars, trucks, motorcycles, trains. We've seen electrification, all forms of energy to power trains, boats and ships, same again, alternative forms. And finally, aviation, whether that be fixed wing or rotary as well. That is a super fast lap of the open source climate tech landscape 1.0.
Yeah, that's got to be the fastest overview of the entire climate tech landscape anyone's ever done, but great job. And I just want to kind of plus one. I really do agree with that decision to parse out built environment and mobility. It's I think a bit of a simplification when they're bucketed together. And I'm glad that we've been able to, look at some of the context underneath in that way.
Yeah.
What?
I think, sorry,
Beth. No, you go first. I'll ask.
I was going to say, there's no doubt this will change.
Sure.
This is 1.0. We've made a lot of changes in the last few days, weeks, months, like lots of changes, lots of still internal, arguments and debates, let alone this week, sharing this with customers and partners and, new relationships from the finance community, from the investment community, from, government, NGOs, operators, energy operators. Just, we can see that we're so close to, being happy with it, but it's just going to keep evolving as well as we learn more and as the space evolves too.
Yeah. Is it lining up with what you're hearing at COP, or are there things that are making you go, oh, I should move this around or split this one out?
It's a great question. One of the things when we're building the taxonomy is obviously we want to represent what's big now, but we also want to represent what's emerging and we think is important. And so there's areas on here which I think people are generally well aware of, say renewable energy. There's, been a big conversation about, renewable energy alone cannot fulfill the energy gap. So we're going to need other forms. I think people have kind of well understood that. Mm-hmm. Big conversations around alternative sources, some of those topical, nuclear and hydrogen in the main. Massive conversation about fossil fuels, of course. So I think energy is really well represented. I think some of the environment gets lost. Agriculture and food systems, a lot of people don't make the connection to emissions and to climate. You need to do a little bit more work. We all need to do a better job of explaining why that category is here and which parts of agriculture are not part of climate tech as well. I think, in infrastructure, I think, you made the point, Beth, you've spent a lot of time in this space as well, so you can see that connection. But we've received a lot of positive feedback about really isolating and separating some of the parts, not just conflating something big, because there's trends underneath that are important to understand. So I think in the main, we've done a really good job. I just don't know whether we've represented some of the emerging spaces well enough.
Well, good thing it's evolving. Excellent. All right. Hate to be time police, but I know we've got some benchmarking to run through. So
cool.
Let's do that.
Good call. All right, let's do some really quick benchmarking. All of this is going to be in the report that we'll share next week. Everyone who has joined the webinar will automatically send you a copy, but it'll be on both globalclimatetechlandscape.org and holoniq.com. But here what you're seeing is basically some regional stratification on the left, just the 3 mega regions, Americas, APAC, and Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And on the right, each of the regions that we dived into and the distribution or the share of their 50, 100, 200. Their biggest outliers here for me, you can see North America, 63% environment. That's really strong versus, say, Europe has 41% energy, like a much bigger footprint on the energy side. If you look all the way over to the right at some of the emerging markets where we only did 50s, you see a lot of variation. But say MENA, 80% focused on the environment, very low focus on energy. Or Sub-Saharan Africa, quite the opposite, 56% focus on energy, very much smaller focus on the environment. Jumping in another layer again, you can see here the 10 subsectors and the share and their representation in each of these. There's a lot going on here, and it requires, a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and, some glasses to really unpack the trend here. But on the full right-hand side, the most interesting is that global representation of the stack. So we're seeing strong representation of renewables, less so in those alternative resources, critical minerals, nuclear, hydrogen. Storage is big, primarily driven by EV charging. Biosphere, not so much, which is a concern. Our oceans, our forests, we need more attention there. Agri-food is big. That's great. Circular economy, big. Carbon, growing very fast. Data and finance is big as well. The built environment, this is a much more mature sector in terms of thinking of green buildings and heating and cooling, but still needs a lot of focus. And then mobility is big. We've all seen that in whether it's electrification or micromobility as well. Second last set of stats, let's look at time. So here we split out when these companies were founded, and the dark blue down the bottom means they were founded through COVID. And so it's really interesting to see, say, on the left-hand side, the Americas, and then on the right, you can see North America or Southeast Asia. Talking 10+% of those cohorts were founded through COVID, which is just incredible when you think about that. You see some of the younger cohorts, Southeast Asia on the full right again, 14% founded through COVID, 68% founded in the prior 4 years as well, versus some of the older cohorts as part of this. So Europe, a little bit more mature in climate technology. So representing an older cohort as part of that. And kind of last data hit, I promise, is looking at the evolution. So when we throw that founded year on the x-axis down the bottom, on the left-hand side, let's look at agri-food, for example. You can see of the 1,000, 8% of that pre-2010 cohort were in agriculture, whereas in the last period, more recently, nearly a quarter of the cohort was agriculture and food systems. And the flip side trend you can see in that chart on the left is renewables. There's a much larger share back earlier in the previous decade of the stack than there has been recently, where there's been less focus on renewables and more focus on other parts of the climate tech stack. And on the right, this I think is just really fascinating how this has popped out. Europe, Middle East, and Africa, more than 50% of the pre-2010 cohort and shrinking through time. But Americas, only represents 16% of the pre-2010 cohort. It's a much more youthful part of the Climate Tech 1000. Of course, we tried to provide some balance in the selection process, but prima facie, we're looking for the most promising and most innovative climate tech startups in each of these regions around the world.
So fascinating. Yeah, wow. Some of that's really surprising. I wouldn't have expected some of the kind of scale shifting in that. Really, really fascinating. And I know I'm not alone in saying I can't wait to dive into more of this in the report. And we're expecting it next week, right?
Yeah, Monday, Tuesday. I don't think it's a secret. There'll be a few people, myself included, polishing some pages up over the weekend. We've learned a lot this week as well. Not that there's any scope to change it, but I think early next week, and as mentioned, everyone who's watching this live will receive. We'll send you a copy early next week to dive in. So not too long to wait now.
Excellent. Can't wait. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We promised it would be short and action-packed, and I think we delivered on that. If you want to stay in the loop with the various pieces we covered today, like Pat said, we'll be following up with the report shortly. You'll also be getting a recording of this webinar in your inbox shortly as well, and this will be on YouTube pretty soon. Definitely check out the Global Climate Tech Landscape. It's right there on the URL. And also check out our website, hollandiq.com, to sign up for our newsletter. And if you're at COP and you want to catch up with us, definitely reach out to hello@hollandiq.com. Thanks, everyone. And Pat, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth, and thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.